Thanks for having us back. One of the things that Kim wanted us to talk about was what happens after you get approval. So one of the things that I'm responsible for in the Office of Responsible Research Practices is NonCompliance, and what that means for our human protection program here at Ohio State and that whole process. So I'll talk about that a little bit. But what we recognize is that PIs, when they take on the responsibility to do research, they're responsible for a lot of things. And in our world, we look at OHRP, which if I had a pointer, it's at the very top. So we're really focused on protecting human subjects. But we recognize that PIs have all these other rules and regulations, sponsor requirements from NIH, or if you're in the medical world, you have Pfizer and your pharmaceutical companies and what they require the PI to be aware of. We have state laws and other policies that we need to be thoughtful of when we take on overseeing research from start to finish. And PIs are the individual who have that privilege to be in that position. But thankfully, they work usually with a team of people to make sure that they're overseeing the research and conducting it appropriately. So, as we all know, the principal investigator has a scientific and/or scholarly training to assume the responsibilities of overseeing the ethical conduct of research involving human subjects. We look at them to have the technical and administrative oversight for the research, and also be the responsible team leader to make decisions. And as I said, we also know that they have a whole team of people. So how many of you are actual principal investigators? Okay, and then it looks like about half of you are also just individuals who are either key personnel or co-investigators working with, if you're a student here, you're working with an advisor on a particular project, and you take on a lot of responsibilities yourself. But the PI ultimately is the one who has to make sure that the whole team is in the loop with everything and knows what their responsibilities are. And individuals who are either accessing data about participants, identifiable private information, consenting individuals are, as Joni had mentioned, engaged in the research process and need to actually be approved to do those research tasks through our office as well. So we're going to talk a little bit in detail about what these responsibilities are and what that means overall for the research team. So when I look at the buckets of how do you successfully manage research studies from start to finish, it really is this combination of things. Is everybody educated? Did they know what tasks they were delegated, and do they have the training to perform those tasks and do them right? What's the communication plan and the monitoring plan for the research in real time? Data management and record keeping, we'll go into more detail. There was a lot of questions we got before the session started that Kim got when people registered about data management and data retention. So I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on that, about what the policies are here at Ohio State, and then the reporting requirements. And we have policy responsibilities of principal investigators, co-investigators, and key personnel that actually go into more detail of all of this, again, from the human subjects perspective. We will reference other policies at the institution that you need to be aware of that don't go in great detail, but always think that there's more than just human subjects research policies that may govern the research that you're involved with. So when you look at education, delegation, and training, we look at, is the individual qualified? So do you have a CV? In the medical world, that's a very common thing. What's your CV? What's your training, your background, your education, your job description? If you're a staff employee here, does it make sense that you're doing the specific tasks that are outlined in the research protocol? And then conflict of interest. So one of the things we always look at when you submit a new protocol to our office is whether or not you have a conflict of interest with whoever may be funding the study from a bigger perspective at the institution, and there's a whole office that manages that, but we interface with them on that, and define roles and responsibilities. So before an individual can actually perform a task like consenting an individual to be part of a study, they actually have to submit an amendment to our office to be approved as a co-investigator or key personnel to do those activities. So do you have the approval, and does that individual understand what's been delegated to them as part of the research team from the PI? We look at human subjects training. City training is what we require before we can even approve you to be listed as key personnel or co-investigator, and that's something that's done online. And then external personnel. So a lot of you guys are in the education realm, right? So you might be engaged with other school districts and working with other teachers or other institutions. When those individuals are engaged in research, maybe they're helping consent or get survey information from students in the classrooms. When they're engaged, then we have to have other agreements with our institutions so that they can actually be involved in that research. If they're not engaged, you have to make sure you have a process to keep them not engaged in the process. Maybe they're just handing out the consent forms, but they're not really explaining anything. You have to make sure you kind of think through systematically how you're going to make the research take place without getting people caught up in things that you don't have approval for them to do yet. So kind of think about those instances, but we have formal investigator agreements that our office executes with those individuals, and also research-specific training. So what training on the actual protocol, do people understand what they're supposed to be doing for informed consent, or what the protocol is requiring you to do? And SOPs, I was joking with Kim earlier, in the medical world, we're really driven by SOPs, and so that's not a common thing in the education world, but just think about what are the guidelines so everyone knows what their responsibilities are. So communication and monitoring, what's the communication plan? Especially if you're involved in these research projects that are branching out to other academic institutions or other school districts or other colleges across campus. How are you actually going to orchestrate all of that? That's a lot of work, and there are some folks that have really, really big projects that are complicated and lots of other entities involved, and you have to have a robust plan for how are you going to communicate things in real time to the staff involved in the research. Also, is it research meetings? Do you document what was discussed so that there's an audit trail? So again, part of my role is I'm coming on the outside, and if I have to do an audit and you say we meet every week and we discuss these topics and these are the decisions that were made, and I can't find any documentation of it, and it causes some non-compliance to occur, I'm going to question whether or not that meeting actually took place because there's no evidence of that. So think about how you document those meetings. Is it webinars? Is it online communications via email? Whatever it is, just figure out what makes sense for your project. And then also, how are you going to communicate to the IRB and the sponsors? We'll talk a little bit more about reporting requirements that PIs need to be aware of, and to the participants. So if they're enrolled in the study and something changes, do you have letters that go out to them? Do those letters need to be approved by the IRB? So all of these things have to kind of be thought through when you start your study for how you're going to keep everybody in the loop. And then what's the monitoring plan? So you've delegated all those responsibilities. You're the PI of a study. I have multiple grad students that are going out, they're consenting, they're enrolling, they're doing surveys. I'm not really involved in the day-to-day activities of everything, but how do I make sure they're all doing what they're supposed to be doing as the protocol is written and as it's been approved? So how do we make sure that participants are enrolled? If you're doing a randomized study and you say, oh, half the class is going to get this and the other class is going to get that, what's your process for that, and how do you make sure that that process is adhered to? Make sure individuals are eligible. So if you have clear definitions of the type of population that you're recruiting for a study, make sure those individuals enrolled in the study actually qualify to be on the study. Randomization I mentioned. Event reporting, and again we'll talk about reporting in more detail in a little bit. And then you're following your protocols. So if you say you're going to do a specific intervention and it's approved to be part of the protocol, make sure you're doing that. If you change something and you don't come to the IRB first for approval, we would look at that as noncompliance. Now it might be minor noncompliance, maybe it doesn't increase risk to the individual, but if you change something from what the board has approved, we would look at that as a protocol deviation and consider it as noncompliance. And we'll go into detail of what that means on the back end if noncompliance is found. And then investigational product, I don't think you guys are involved a whole lot of that, but PIs in the medical world, if they're doing device or drug studies, also have FDA regulations they need to be aware of and make sure that they're fulfilling all of their obligations for overseeing drug and device studies. And then once again, document. It's very, very important. You guys are in, these studies can last months, years. Some studies we have from like 1970 something that are still ongoing. So what's the life of this study? How do you document that you have new people involved in the study all the time, that they know what they're doing, that you're monitoring things, that you as the PI have control and you know where the records are, who's enrolled, continuing reviews are done, all of that. You have to have a plan to document all of this information. And we'll talk about why that's important. So data management and record keeping. There are a lot of studies that go into great detail about how they're going to manage the data. A lot of you guys do surveys, online surveys, your social behavioral world. Oh my gosh, the attachments that you guys use with all your instruments is mind-blowing. I've seen studies that have like 40 appendixes with all the instruments, and how do you keep track of all that stuff to make sure you're using the right version, that you're giving the right ones to the right participant group? So what is your data management plan when you have all those surveys to begin with, and then when you get them back from individuals, how are you going to store it? Where are you going to keep it? Who has access to it? Is it going to be electronic? Are there video recordings? And really kind of think through the security, privacy, and confidentiality of this. And this is stuff that we ask you on the application. So I'm going to go into a little bit more detail because people get very, very confused about what's privacy, confidentiality, and security. They kind of sometimes think it's all the same thing, and so some of the administrative speed bumps when you're doing the application, we might push it back to you and say, well, you didn't really address confidentiality the way you're supposed to, so can you please give us some more feedback on how things are going to be stored and kept confidential. So when we look at privacy, we're really talking about the person a little bit more. So examples of that would be if I walk into the grocery store and someone approaches me and wants to consent me for a study that is sensitive in nature, and they're talking openly and my kids are with me and it kind of catches me off guard, that doesn't feel very private. It feels like an invasion of my privacy. Same is true for medical record research, or if think about FERPA in your world, these are private records of individuals. And so if I got a letter from someone saying, hey, looks like you qualify for this study, and I'm trying to figure out how the heck you even know anything about me to think that I might qualify for a study, I don't know who you are, that also feels like an invasion of my privacy. So those are some things to kind of think through. I always tell people, if you were the individual who was approached or got the letter in the mail or the email, wouldn't you question why you got it and try to put some safeguards in place to make sure that you're protecting that privacy and people feel respected in the process? And again, we have a detailed policy on privacy and confidentiality that has more examples and can give you some tips on operationally how to make that happen. Did I skip something? Yes. Sorry. Confidentiality. So this is more about the data. So I've collected the data, and how do we keep it confidential? Who has access to it? What did we tell the participants we were going to do with it? So if we consented them and we said, oh, it's going to be in a locked cabinet, only the people in our research team are going to have it, we're not going to give it to other institutions. What did we promise people that we were going to do to kind of not only protect the privacy of the individual, but how we're going to manage that information now that we have it so that way it's not out for everyone to see. So some of the considerations that we look for on your application are you going to code the information? Do you really need their identifiers? Do you need their name and their birthday, their medical record number, social security number? Do you need all of those things? Or once you have the information, can you just give them a code and then get rid of the identifiers, and once you're ready for analysis, you just analyze the data without the identifiers? So those are some of the things that people propose and is very common practice. How do you limit the access? So who has it? Is it just on a shared drive that anyone in your department can see? Or do you have it, password protected, it's encrypted in a particular place that only the research team can see? Or, paper. Some people still use paper, locked cabinets. Actually, I think it's safer. I'm a paper girl. This electronic stuff kind of throws me off. But is it in a locked cabinet? Who has a key? All of that stuff. We do have very specific policies at this institution if you have not looked at them. The OCIO has a university policy on institutional data, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that as it pertains to research, but there are specific places you cannot keep PHI or personally identifiable information. Buckeye Box, for example, has restrictions of what you can put in there. Some of the survey stuff, I know Qualtrics is something you guys use a lot. There's certain settings you need to create to make sure that it doesn't have certain identifiers that you get back from the individual who completes the survey. So you have to be really thoughtful about the tools that you're using. Does it actually meet the expectations of not only the policies here at OSU, but also what the board approved you to do with that data? Med Center has lots of policies because they're very protective of HIPAA and making sure that we follow the HIPAA regulations, and they have specific policies and more tools, to be very honest, for researchers to protect research data that might have PHI in it. So be aware of those. Most of these policies talk about different storage devices, from servers to laptops to phones. If you're videotaping people, other types of survey online tools of what's okay and what's not okay to put in those types of devices. Encryption, I cannot tell you enough. If you are putting anything on your laptop, if you're taking images with your personal phone, whatever it is, make sure it's encrypted. You can call your IT department or the OCIO to kind of get feedback on how to best do this. But if you tell someone you're going to protect their information and keep their data confidential, and you put it all on your laptop and your laptop is stolen, and we find out that it had PHI on it or whatever, then we have to involve other processes like notifying the HIPAA privacy officer, and it becomes a bigger concern for the institution because we didn't protect it the way that we're required to by the regulations. And then restricted data, like PHI, it just can't go in certain devices or storage databases. So think about what that restricted data might be if you're working with it, or whether or not you need it. If you really don't need it to do your analysis, maybe you can kind of strip those identifiers off and make your research easier to conduct. So this leads me to record retention policy and research data. And this, again, I'm going in more detail because there were people who had asked for this information, because I think it is an area, especially in student research. What do you do with all of this? What are you required to do from a retention and maintenance perspective? So research records, I think the first thing to clarify, what we state in our policy and what we're referring to is the study protocol, the consent forms, the surveys, the IRB correspondence, the email communication, anything that together collectively supports the research project from start to finish. And we talk about retaining those for audit and inspection purposes for at least 3 years after the research has ended. And I'm always going to put a disclaimer on there, unless the sponsor tells you to keep it longer. If it's FDA regulated, there's completely other different requirements of how long you need to keep that information. And depending on publication and IP purposes, you may need to keep that information longer. So this information needs to be protected and confidential, just as you had intended and told the participants in the IRB you would do, but for the purposes of audit and making sure that if someone had to put the pieces of the puzzle together, all the information's there to do so. Now, research data is a little bit different. So research data should be archived for a minimum of 5 years after the final project closeout, with the primary data retained at Ohio State University. And faculty members hate it when we tell them this, but Ohio State University owns the data for Ohio State. So anything that you develop, you need to work with the institution. If you're to leave, and I'll talk about that in a second, leave the institution, who holds it, who's allowed to have it, what did we tell the individuals in sponsored programs or with any of the sponsors as far as where that data is going to live. But we're required to maintain primary data at Ohio State for up to 5 years, if not longer. And again, the disclaimer of, if it's intellectual property, other federal requirements or state laws, depending on the type of data that it is. And then the whole point of this, again, is to be able to prove accuracy of the primary data and that it's in compliance with the laws. So a good example of this is when people publish and then someone at another institution says, I think that's all made up. I don't think that's real. And so we as an institution could be challenged to go back and say, okay, prove to us, how did you get to those results? And so that's partly why we maintain everything, is we need to be able to go back and prove that it wasn't falsified, it was the real data, and here's how we got there and put all the pieces together. So there's lots of other reasons that we keep it for 5 years, but that is really to make sure that we can validate and tell everyone that the research we're doing is accurate and maintain the primary data to prove that. Individuals who are at Ohio State and then they want to leave, and this comes up a lot. It's my data, I worked on it, I've been here 5 years, if I want to take it with me and continue to work on it, there are specific things you have to do at this institution to be able to do that. One of those things is that we look at is what's the consent language. What did we tell participants? If we told someone in the consent form that only Ohio State researchers are going to have access to this information, then we're in a little bit of a pickle as far as what do we do as an institution? Are we allowed to actually take that information and send it somewhere else? Because that's not what we told individuals we were going to do with their data. Is it identifiable? Maybe if it's de-identified, maybe we have the opportunity to have some wiggle room with that. Is it the primary data, or is it just a copy so that we can keep the primary data here? So those are all things that our office gets involved with sometimes to help work through to see what did they have approval for, what did the consent language say. But there's also an approval process that the department chair, the dean, the vice president of research has to sign off on an agreement with the other institution to say, okay, we're going to let you take this. Here's who's responsible for what. Here's what you can take. Here's what you can do with it. Here's what you can't do with it, depending on the nature of the research and whether or not there's IP attached to it. So there's all sorts of considerations. And then also tech licensing, tech commercial licensing, and office here at the institution will also create the data use agreement, which is the actual transfer of those materials and the agreement to how that's transferred to the other institution. So think about these things. It has come up. I will tell you, conducting non-compliance reviews, we have had queries come up to say, okay, go do an audit, and I go and do an audit, and they're like, I don't have that. The PI took that. I don't have any of the consent forms. I don't have any of the data, and there's nothing I can really do because it's not there anymore, and they didn't really have the right to take it because it wasn't theirs and the agreements were in place. So then it actually becomes a bigger issue than just a human subjects protection piece. But you got to make sure that you have the right approvals to take data with you if you're going to leave the institution. So routine reporting, again, to go back to PI responsibilities, looking at routine reporting, we talk about continuing review. So if you have expedited review or full IRB review, you're required, at least for now, until the regs come out that might change some of this stuff, to update our office every year. So we have an annual review, and you submit information on how many individuals were enrolled, if anything crazy happened or changed with your research, and we look at it, and if everything looks great, you get another year to continue doing what you're doing and move on with your research. We did just last week started an annual status report, and I think it was in OSU Today as well, but it's starting to trickle in. So the regulations give us a little bit of flexibility. So if you do not have federal funding, if it's minimal risk research, or maybe you're just in data analysis only, you don't have to fill out the full application for continuing review. It's just a shortened, like, hey, nothing's changed with the research, there's no funding, we're not actively recruiting, it's minimal risk, and then you're done. You still have to do that every year, but it doesn't actually get reviewed by the full board or an expedited review process. It's more of an administrative acknowledgement. So it saves some time on our end to make us more efficient, so we're not reviewing all these applications. And this will be huge for the social and behavioral world because most of your stuff is minimal risk. A lot of it's not federally funded. So instead of having to go through the full application process, we have a shortened version now. So hopefully you'll have the opportunity to do that. And I think it's going well so far, but all new as of last week. Changes in research, so routine reporting to the IRB. If you're going to change anything with your research that is different than what was initially proposed, unless it's to eliminate the immediate harm to participants, which I can't see so much in the behavioral world. In the medical world, if you know, gosh, this drug is going to put this person in the hospital and their blood count's going to drop again and I don't think it's safe for them, you can make that clinical decision to say, I am not going to follow my protocol because it's not in the best interest of this individual. Social behavioral world, it's hard to kind of come up with an example of what that might be. So when you make changes to research, you have to have prior approval. You can't just change it. Even if it's, hey, I had 10 surveys, but I decided this survey wasn't as good and it wasn't really helpful, so now I'm just going to do 5 surveys. You need to tell us that. So you have to come back before you can do that. And I know a lot of people think, well, I lessened what I wasn't getting more, but you still changed your interaction and intervention with the individuals and the data that you were collecting, so that needs prior approval. Change in supportive funding. A lot of folks that receive funding don't realize, at least in the NIH world, that the IRB has the responsibility to look at congruency. So during the life of your protocol, maybe you don't have federal funding initially, but within 6 months or a year, you get additional funding. You need to let our office know, because part of our job and the board's job is to make sure that what you told the federal government you were going to do for your research also matches what we approved you to do for your research. And so we prompt people at continuing review to give us that information, because sometimes when they get the award, they forget in real time. We should be looking at that as well. But that is something that should be reported to our office on a routine basis. And then change in personnel. So, you know, you initially didn't think these teachers at the elementary school were going to be engaged in the research, but the way it's been operating, they seem to be more involved in it. We need to know about it, and you need to actually get a change in personnel and submit an amendment to add them to the protocol for consenting, or whatever. Maybe they're doing data collection and being a little bit more involved in the research than you initially thought. You need to come back to the office and let us know, and that would get approved through the IRB as well. And then final study reports. So when you're done, let us know how it went and where you are with everything, and provide us with a summary report at the end so that we can close out the study. Event reporting, just very briefly, this is for stuff that happens that we're required as an institution to report out if we think that an unanticipated problem has occurred at our institution. So if something happened to an individual enrolled in a study that wasn't expected, but we found out it might be related to the intervention of the study, we have to report that out to the federal government. And so with that, we have an event reporting form that you can use. Again, social behavioral, not a whole lot of stuff we see with this, but that could also include maybe you put a bunch of FERPA information on your laptop and you lost it, and now that was not something that we told the individuals who enrolled in the study. That could be a potential risk. We might have to investigate that. They might have to report it to individuals, and how do we prevent that from happening in the future? That could be a risk that I can see on your side of the world that may need to be reported to our office in real time so we can help address that as an institution. But there's some other random things on there that may not apply to your type of research. All right, so briefly I will talk about non-compliance, because this is my everyday life. And we define non-compliance as intentional or unintentional to comply with the federal regulations, state law or local law, the requirements or determinations of the IRB or university policies regarding research involving human subjects. It can result from action or omission, and it might be serious, non-serious, or serious, and it may be continuing. And I'll explain what that means. So we have these buckets that we look at things in, and so if something is considered non-serious or minor, we look at that to be something that happened that didn't increase the risk to the individual, didn't compromise their rights or their welfare, or affect the integrity of the data. Things that we look at is continuing review, lapsed, minimal risk study, you're a week late in submitting your continuing review, so your protocol's technically terminated. You shouldn't be doing any research during that termination time. It was an administrative error. You submitted everything, you got it reapproved. It didn't really hurt anybody, so they would usually say it was minor. Minor deviations from the protocol that, again, didn't change the study interactions with the individuals are just some examples of what that might be. Serious noncompliance is the potential to increase the risk to the participants. So maybe you collected data on individuals without getting their consent, enrolled ineligible subjects, conducted research without getting approval prior to doing the intervention. I've seen failure to report serious adverse events that if the board would have reviewed it, we would have required you to change your consent form and inform all the participants. Or more generally, what we see is just bad oversight of the PI. Have no idea where the documents are. I don't know what my students are doing on the research project. I couldn't tell you how many people I've enrolled, not really engaged or responsible for the overconduct of the research. So that leads the board to believe, well, maybe they are doing that with all of their research, but they're the ones who are supposed to be responsible and making sure everybody else knows what they're doing. So if they're not involved, what the heck is happening? And are we involving participants in research that puts them at a disadvantage because it's not being managed appropriately? Continuing non-compliance is another bucket we look at. It could be serious or non-serious, but if we see a pattern, a repeated pattern of someone doing the same thing over and over again, we would want to intervene in some way and have a corrective action. So when we talk about corrective actions, the things that the board looks at are, do we need to modify the protocol or the consent process? Do we need to monitor them? So should we go and audit them every 6 months to make sure they know what they're doing now? Additional education and mentoring of the actual staff or the PI, modifications of continuing review cycles. So sometimes I've seen that, we don't want to wait a whole year to see how you're doing with your study. We want you to submit something every 6 months because we want to keep our tabs on you and make sure you've corrected your mistakes and won't make that mistake again. And then putting limitations on investigator activities on very rare circumstances. If we feel that the PI cannot correct past behavior moving forward, we will revoke PI privileges, and that's like the last thing we want to do, but the board certainly has gone down that path when they've exhausted all other options for the individual. Sometimes it's just a year, sometimes it's 2 years, and then the individual can apply for PI privileges again, at which point we would monitor the research a little bit more closely. We could also put limitations on the use of data. So if you went and you conducted a study and you never had approval to do that, and you have all this great data and you really want to publish it, the board could come back and say, you never had approval to even do that. You can't use the data for that purpose. And then again, study suspension or termination. I've seen this happen, especially when studies get passed down. We have studies that are valuable. We have lots of co-investigators on it. The PI leaves the institution. Another co-investigator says, sure, I'll take that on. It's valuable information. But there's not a really good changing of the guard, so they don't have all the previous documents. They can't put the full study from start to finish together. They don't even have the original regulatory documents. Maybe they're using the wrong protocol version or consent forms. It ends up getting to the point where it's just cleaner for them to start over. And so the board may recommend that suspension or termination of the study so that they can have a clean slate and move forward. So those are some of the corrective actions that we see. Non-compliance can come through a lot of different ways. Sometimes at continuing review when people are submitting, oh, here's the protocol version, here's the consent form I'm using. What we find out is if it doesn't line up, the board starts questioning things like, well, this isn't what you were approved to use, so why are you using this? And the board could ask for an audit to take place, or if they over-enrolled, if you said, I'm going to recruit 100 individuals and you recruit 200, they might be concerned about that. So non-compliance can kind of come through that way. Event reports, when people are self-reporting things that happen. And also, there's a thing called ethics point here at the institution. So if someone had a concern about the research practices overall, internal and external people can notify the institution of concerns that they have, and we might be asked to kind of investigate that a little bit further. One of the other areas that we get is especially questioning whether or not someone had appropriate IRB approval for the research is when people publish. We've certainly had people inquire if they had the right approval, because in their publication they say, I had IRB approval to do all these things. And so sometimes we're asked to compare what was published versus what they had approval for or did not have approval for to see if it supported the research that was conducted. So it comes through very, very various different avenues, and sometimes it's really benign and sometimes it becomes a little bit more complicated and outside of the scope of even our office. So with all of that, I think the most important thing is to make sure when we talked about like the training and the education and bless you, contact our office before you implement any changes. Make sure that you're doing things in real time, because you don't want to be on the back end. Most of the things that we see in non-compliance are completely preventable. A lot of people just didn't know, like, I didn't know, I just tweaked this. I didn't know I wasn't allowed to do that, or I thought it was approved for this many individuals, and I didn't know, I thought it was not human subjects research, and it was, but I didn't check with our office. So think through those things up front, because you never want to be in this scenario. I mean, this is all fixable, it's education. Which is why we do all the outreach stuff, because we want people to know the considerations. But if you ever have a question, you need to contact our office, and we'll help you work through things on the front end and tell you what you need to do to maintain compliance. If non-compliance, serious or continuing noncompliance is determined, there is internal reporting that we're required to do, which includes the institutional official, the dean, the vice president, or the vice dean for research if you have one in your college, and the chair, and all the co-investigators on the protocol. Depending on the nature of the noncompliance, we may have to involve other departments like OSP, tech licensing, legal affairs, for things that we find are outside of the scope of human subjects protection. If it's federally funded, we're required to report externally. So we have to report it to OHRP, to NIH, for any of the funding agencies, the FDA, if it's FDA regulated. Sometimes we ask people to report it to the participants because it's important for them to know if something has been mishandled with the research that they participated in. And this is something we really don't like to do, because once you kind of go to NIH and you say, yeah, we didn't really do all the stuff we said we were going to do, then we're at risk of losing our funding and external investigations, and we just don't want to be in that position. And again, all these things are very preventable, but we do have a policy on noncompliance. You're more than welcome to look at that on our website. That goes into a lot more detail of what that process is, and some additional excuse me, examples of what that might be. And all of that is part of what our office supports. You know, we have the operational aspects, which we talked to you about last time, but a lot of what Joni and I talked about today was the Human Research Protection Program, which is really to make sure that we're protecting the rights and the welfare of individuals who are enrolled in human subjects research, try to comply with the Belmont report and the Department of Health and Human Services regulations and FDA regulations. We maintain the federal-wide assurance, which is basically our agreement with the government to say we're going to do all the right stuff as an institution. We're going to make sure all the people who are doing research understand their responsibilities and protect human subjects in their research as well. So thank you for being here, and hopefully it gives you some insight, the behind the scenes of the real life stuff that we deal with. But you know, we're here to help you guys on the front end, so please let us know if you ever have questions as you're going through stuff. I think that's all I had.